Here in Chapter 5, we're going to talk about the concept of shared responsibility and some controversy around it. So, when we think about this, sometimes we talk about what contribution the victim has made to the criminal incident. What role do they play in their victimization? Victimologists raise the question of shared responsibility, and this implies that certain victims did something quote-unquote wrong, did not do all they could do to minimize their exposure, and some victims may even be maximizing their exposure. So let's start with this idea. Victimization doesn't appear to be a random process striking by chance. So for example, if we look at data from the NCBS, we find that unlawful entries and stranger rapes are more frequent during warmer months. Well, let's think about why. An offender-centered answer might say burglars and rapists are more active during those months. But another answer might say that something about their targets changes with the season, providing more opportunities to strike, people are outside more, they spend more time away from home, and are more likely to leave their windows open. So first victimologists to look at risk factors thought that certain personal attributes play a role in a target's vulnerability. Something makes them attractive to potential offenders. So things that might make somebody attractive to someone who uses deception and fraud might be people who are less educated, newly arrived immigrants, people who are mentally challenged. What makes someone attractive to a con artist might be someone who is lonesome or heartbroken. So one thing we know is that situational factors are going to play a role here. And situational factors are going to impact our vulnerability, how vulnerable we are as a potential victim or an actual victim to crime. So, for example, someone might lie in wait as payday approaches, looking to take Social Security checks when they arrive in the mail. Someone might wait for a storekeeper to be closing up before they decide to rob or burglarize that place. Prostitutes who work the street, they're willing to go off alone, they often abuse alcohol and drugs, and crimes against them are not taken very seriously. Usually they're not going to be considered a very reputable witness. In terms of victimizing a tourist, most often are not willing to come back to testify. Hawaii just began paying for a victim witness return project to help raise convictions and decrease crimes against tourists. What it does is it basically pays for them to come back, and they also speak with their employees to explain why it is important for them to be able to come back and testify in court. So what determines the fact that we all have different levels of risk? So we can look at a few things. First of all, how attractive is a target, right? Some people might appear, quote unquote, ripe for the taking. How easy does it appear to be that you could take something from them? What's their proximity? Can you get within range of that target? Okay, so this becomes a huge disadvantage for people who are regularly near offenders. There's a factor referred to as the deviant place factor. There are some places that are attractive. We often refer to these as crime hotspots. So crowded public spaces, desolate areas that police rarely patrol, venues that have heavy drinking or drug use. And then how vulnerable is your target? Can they resist attack? Is the target well guarded or are they undefended? So when we take these factors together, we get a lifestyles and routine activities approach. And this is looking at how do you spend your time, how do you spend your money, okay? And this often appears to be freely chosen, but it's also restricted by social constraints. So think about the difference between how different groups of people might spend their Friday night. How does a teen spend their Friday night versus an adult? Some forms of amusement and entertainment put us at higher risk. If we're just aimlessly driving around, if we're engaging in illicit activity. And so these differences in our lifestyle lead to variations in how much exposure we have to risk. So basically, the key factor here is exposure. So young people are willing to go out and meet strangers, which puts them at a much higher risk. Moms and dads tend to be involved in family-centered activities, which puts them at lower risk. We also know that some murders are the result of a sequence of events, okay, a character content or a transaction. So, some people also, some victims who engage in high-risk lifestyles are also seen less empathetically. They're often viewed as fair game or easy prey because they are involved in criminal behavior. We call this the equivalent group explanation, right? So because they're involved in criminal behavior, they're discouraged from going to the police to report their victimization. So when you have overlapping lifestyles, that increases your risk. Victims and offenders involved in racketeering, gangs, drug dealing are much more likely to become victims themselves. So in the 80s, we saw this with drug trade-related murders, okay? There were murders over turf, over high prices, inferior product, and dealers and customers were also getting robbed. So the drug trade does involve a substantial amount of interpersonal violence, but the numbers can be easily manipulated to change impressions of the problem. So this explanation helps explain this carnage that occurs amongst teen boys during the mid-80s, early 90s. About 85% of these deaths were due to gunfire, and it was part of this self-perpetuating cycle of aggression and retaliation by young men involved in the drug trade. So as legitimate opportunities, recreational opportunities are disappearing, as failing schools, and as a subculture of violence, this is increasing the body count. It also sheds light on the connection between drinking and violence. So alcohol consumption is more consistently linked with violence than drug use is. Okay? It's also a cause of a lot of interpersonal conflicts that often escalate to fatal outcomes. So 64% of killings involve either the victim or offender drinking before or during the conflict. So a typical alcohol-related slaying is a young man stabbed to death in a bar on a weekend as a result of a fight with an acquaintance or friend. So two mechanisms help explain this. Well, first of all, if you binge or drink heavily, your judgment may be clouded, your actions could be misinterpreted, and you're going to be less restrained. And this is referred to as selective disinhibition. Also, we have this outlier attractor perspective. People gather at certain places with the expectation of taking time out from normal constraints and in anything goes environments. One thing to really think about too here is that there's often an implication under this, this equivalent group explanation that these victims' suffering is somehow less deserving of compassion and support. So remember, routine activities theory talks about three important variables. We need a motivated offender, we need an attractive target, and we need there to be no capable guardians present. So offenders are going to seize opportunities when attractive targets are unguarded. And this is affected by our everyday patterns, okay, our everyday lifestyles, where we commute, where we shop, where we go to school, where we go to work. As those activities shift away from the home and towards interactions with people who are not our family members, our risk increases, okay? So these approaches, this lifestyle and routine activities approach, are looking at patterns of behavior engaged in by entire groups of people as opposed to individual causes. They're going to take offender motivation as a given and instead focus on how we can control that, okay? So what this does is it often results in strategies to minimize our risk and to minimize the harm that might come to us. So what are ways you can make yourself a less attractive target or ways you can increase capable guardianship? So when we think about this and we want to talk about safety precautions and how effective they are, how do we decide how safe is safe enough? Okay, so certain methods seem to work, but how do we know if they're cost effective? So even though the elderly are very vulnerable, they have low rates of robbery. Why? Well, think about their lifestyle and the behavior they engage in. They don't go out drinking late at night at bars. They don't travel by taxi. They're not often in public, unfamiliar places. They're not often drunk and letting their guard down. Most teens and young adults are not willing to pay that price in order to be safer. So making this balance then between our safety and our risk is really a personal decision. And more protection can usually be obtained through more spending, better lighting, more police patrols. But we want to think about how safe is safe enough and what is cost effective. So we also want to think about the messages our society gives us about risk-taking, right? So we get a lot of contradictory messages. On one hand, we value this in business and we reward people who do so. The middle class values, however, emphasize control over one's destiny, planning, building, and investing. So we see this in the way we respond to victims. Some people rush to defend them, other people rush to criticize them. So think of a time when a victim has been criticized. So all of this leads to these strategies to reduce victimization. And what are things you do? Well, sometimes we engage in avoidance strategies. We limit our exposure to dangerous people and situations. Other times we engage in risk management tactics. We minimize chances of being harmed when our exposure is unavoidable. One place we see this through is what's called CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. How do we create well-protected, defensible spaces through target hardening, adding locks, building fences, and maintaining effective surveillance, limiting the number of entrances and trimming bushes. And I would encourage you guys to take a minute or two to Google some CPTED, some places that use this, and kind of see what are some of the things that they're doing. So risk reduction then can be individual, it can be collective, it can be private, or it can be public-minded. When we think about crime prevention, we tend to think about government programs, right, to improve social factors that influence crime. But we're thinking about things that are more like victimization prevention. How do we discourage criminals from attacking particular targets? Okay, this means, though, that individuals need to be crime conscious. Okay, so the valve theory of crime shift says that the number of offenses committed will not drop when targets are hardened. Okay, so it's not going to decrease crime, it's going to change who becomes victimized. What will happen instead is a motivated offender will displace that activity. Okay, they'll still engage in that activity, they'll pick a different place, target, or time. So let's think about deterrence theory and apply it to victims, right? The criminal justice system assumes that the idea of being punished, convicted, or apprehended deters us from committing crime. But do we learn from our bad experiences? Do victims learn from their bad experiences? Does the public learn from the mistakes of victims? Do first-time victims learn their mistakes? So some potential victims are more likely to be deterred than others. White, middle-class, female, middle-aged, or older are more likely to respond to this fear of harm. So again, let's think about shared responsibility. Shared responsibility says that victims as well as criminals did something wrong, okay? When we think about repeat victims, chronic victims, and victim careers, are victims learning from past mistakes, okay? Or are they making the same mistakes over and over again? Are they clouding their judgment due to drinking? Are they failing to safeguard their property? Do they isolate themselves from people who could intervene? Do they spend time with dangerous individuals? But we want to think about how responsible is a victim then, right? So we want to remember that when we're studying victimology, we're trying to see what it is about people, places, activities that make someone more likely to become a victim. This does not mean that victims, however, are responsible, and we want to be careful not to blame victims. What we often hear, though, is we'll hear people talk about completely innocent victims, right? They've reasonably reduced their risks, they haven't done anything negligent. So sometimes you become a victim of a property crime even though you've used security devices or alarms. We also might talk about a victim being totally responsible. This could be a victim posing as an offender and committing fraud. That's only possible when there is no offender. When the victim is totally responsible, there's no offender. They are the offender. So what's the difference then between victim blaming and victim defending? Victim blaming is the arguments that victims bear some responsibility along with their offender, if they somehow facilitated, precipitated, or provoked the event. Victim defending is whether it is accurate or fair to hold a targeted individual accountable for losses or injuries inflicted by the offender. So in terms of victim blaming, we talk about this thing called the just world outlook. People get what they deserve. Bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. We might also talk about personal accountability, right? This is a basic doctrine in our legal system and it encourages victim blaming, right? If you are crime conscious, you should review your lifestyle and routines and increase your personal safety. And victim blaming is the view of the majority of offenders. Most offenders will tell you that it's the victim's fault. Victim defending rejects the idea that victims are partly at fault. They say that victim blaming overstates a victim's involvement, carelessness, or responsibility, and overstates the events of facilitation, precipitation, or provocation. Telling people to be more cautious and to be more vigilant is not an adequate solution. So some issues with shared responsibility, okay? In terms of murder, Wolfgang said the victim is often a major contributor. In terms of rape, Amir said virtuous rape victim is not always an innocent and passive party. In terms of theft, Jeffrey said victims cause crime in the sense that they set up the opportunity for the crime to be committed. And in terms of burglary, Waller and Okihiro said, understand the extent to which a victim vicariously contributes to or precipitates a break-in. So these are researchers that are saying this. So there's two tendencies with victim defending regarding who or what is to be faulted. One looks at the system and one looks at the offender. Okay? In offender blaming, we're not shifting any blame away. We do not shift blame away from the offender onto the victim. In system blaming, we're looking at behaviors of both parties as they're influenced by a social environment. Neither the victim nor the offender is to blame. The system is to blame. System blaming is often linked with victim defending. If the lawbreaker is seen as part of the product of his or her environment and the victim is too, then both of them have been influenced by agents of socialization. Okay, so that's their peers. What does the culture tell them? What has school told them? What's the media told them? What have their parents told them? What has religion told them? In terms of shared responsibility, we talk about three options here: facilitation, precipitation, and provocation. Facilitation is when victims carelessly and inadvertently make it easier for a thief to steal. Precipitation is where the victim significantly contributes to the violent outbreak, and provocation is even worse. The victim is more directly responsible for the crime. So in terms of victim facilitation, this is when a victim unknowingly, carelessly, negligently, and inadvertently made it easier for a criminal to commit a theft. Minor amount of blame. So let's think about auto theft and burglary. You leave your keys dangling in the ignition or you left your window open. Okay? 50% or more of all completed burglaries reported to NCVS were unlawful entries without force. Okay? So the total number of burglaries could be cut in half if people took greater care to lock up their homes. Some are more guilty of facilitation than others. Young people, the number of people in the household matters here, if you live in the West, and renters. Some people will talk about the good old days of not locking their doors, but since people have become more security conscious, burglary rates have dropped 67%. So these are little things you can do to decrease your risk. Lock your door. So let's think about auto theft. The most likely victim is someone under the age of 25, someone who lives in an apartment in an urban inner city, and African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to be victims than whites, and people of low income. We could see here some trends using both the NCVS and the UCR, right? And we can see that motor vehicle theft rates have declined. Victim blaming focuses on the proportion of motorists with bad habits, people who are careless about locks and keys, whereas victim defending focuses on the majority of motorists who did nothing wrong. Okay? Teenagers are no longer the number one people stealing cars. It's organized car rings and chop shops. Your car is actually worth 3 times as much for its parts than the car is actually worth. So when we think about shared responsibility in terms of auto theft, about 75% are people who are conscientiously resisting victims and conventionally cautious victims. 15% are carelessly facilitating victims, and 10% are precipitative initiators, provocative conspirators, and fabricating simulators. What about identity theft? This is the unauthorized appropriation of personal information. Your name, your address, your date of birth, last 4 numbers are your social. Okay. We also know that's pretty common, right? What about victim precipitation and provocation? Okay. Subintentional death refers to people who are killed. It talks about the idea that people who are killed played contributory roles in their deaths by exercising poor judgment, taking excessive risks, or pursuing a self-destructive lifestyle. We also think about justifiable homicide. What if a security officer resorts to deadly force in self-defense? Or what about someone who commits suicide by cop? So we also know that victim precipitation and provocation are often charges hurled at rape victims, murder victims, robbery, and assault victims. Precipitation implies they contributed to their victimization, and provocation means the loser is more responsible than the winner. The first in-depth study is from Wolfgang in Philadelphia, and he studies murders from 1949 to 1952. And he talks about a victim precipitated homicide. And this is where the victim is the first to use force. So the victim, the person who ends up dead, started a fight and ended up dead. In these, usually the victim and offender know each other. They were arguing, and usually over things like a charge of infidelity, money, a drunken brawl, or insult. Nearly all precipitated victims are men, and nearly all totally innocent victims are women. Alcohol is generally playing a role here, and the victim often had previous run-ins with the law. In these cases, the victim and the offender closely resemble each other, okay, in terms of their characteristics. And the precipitated victims, the person who ends up dead, thought they would emerge the victor, right? So basically someone has committed a personal affront against them, they attempt to save face, it escalates, and they end up dead. So basically, these are people living lifestyles that are championing a willingness to use force to resolve their fights. And this is a learned behavior, and if you recall studying the subculture of violence, this is a piece we see there a lot. In another study conducted by the National Commission on Causes and Prevention of Violence, said that in homicides, the person who died was generally the first person to resort to force 22% of the time. In terms of aggravated assault, the seriously injured were the first to use a force 14% of the time. In terms of armed robberies, the victim did not reasonably handle money, jewelry, or valuables 11% of the time. And in forcible rapes, 4% of those were cases where the woman first agreed to sexual relations and then retracted before the act. That last one makes me a little nauseous because as soon as you say no, no means no. In system blaming, remember we've got victim blaming and victim defending arguments, and they're bridging gaps between theoretical ideas of how people think and act. These arguments get caught up in the details of cases, and they often ignore what's going on in the system that might shape both criminals and victims. Okay, so system blaming arguments. In terms of homicide, we glorify violence in our culture. We see it in the media. It's often a form of entertainment. We often see it as a valid method of conflict resolution. In terms of robbery, there's a big gulf between people who are well off and people who are not. And we have an overimportance in our culture on material possessions. In terms of burglary, the fact that there is an organized nature of fencing provides an incentive for people to steal. And in terms of identity theft, there's been so many data breaches that have exposed personal data to thieves, regardless of any efforts made by you as a customer. I would be willing to bet most of you guys have had your information, your debit card, compromised at least once. So nearly all states have passed laws to compel organizations that maintain data banks to notify people when a breach of security takes place. Okay, so you may have gotten a letter in the mail saying your card's been compromised, your bank issues a new card, or a company might offer to put credit monitoring service in place for you. But most police agencies don't have experts in forensic computing, and they're behind the curve in terms of how do you address this type of crime? How do you gather evidence? How do you figure out who did it? So there's a lot of things undermining law enforcement's efforts to fight identity theft. So as I said, most officers don't have training and most agencies don't have adequate resources. There's often a lot of multi-jurisdictional issues here too, and that makes it difficult for anyone to follow through. Also, many instances are not reported to the police. A lot of times the victim isn't even aware of the crime. So in terms of identity theft, what are things you can do? Try to keep your computer, desktop, and laptop secure. Anytime you get a pre-approved credit card invitation or bills or certain types of information, you should shred them. You should discard your receipts and ATM info in a similar way. Use clever passwords. Don't give your social security number to unknown people. Unfortunately, you have to give your social security card number to a lot of people. So why does responsibility matter? Well, it matters for us legally, okay? Whether the victim facilitated, precipitated, or provoked, an offender is considered responsible by police, prosecutors, juries, and everyone else. But it is an issue at many stages of the criminal justice process in terms of restitution, civil lawsuits, and insurance settlements. Your insurance company does not want to hear when your car is stolen that you left the keys in it. Okay, and that wraps up chapter 5.